When Jesus said to his disciples, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth," I wonder what his disciples thought. How far? Because Jesus, as the Creator, as God himself, he knew about people groups really at the ends of the earth. And I think you can throw Tasmania into that, and maybe South America and Southern Africa and way up in the northern parts of America as well. Jesus would have known about the Tasmanian Aboriginals, this group of people in the far south of our country. So how did they get here? Who are they? Because it's important. Evolution is telling us that people came out of Africa. They evolved from apes, chimps, basically, out of Africa. And they ascended through this evolutionary process into men. So this is the picture, the ascent of mankind from apes out of Africa and dispersed around the world. Because the Bible picture is very different. The Bible picture is that God made a very good world, and we were just talking about that, weren't we, in the break, about how hundreds of millions of years of death, disease and suffering and survival of the fittest and mutations, which is the driving force of evolution, which are very harmful, by the way, is not a picture of very good. It's a picture of suffering and heartache, actually. So the Bible talks about two people that were created, Adam and Eve. Jesus refers to them himself about in that marriage discussion. Don't you know that in the beginning God made them male and female? And God said in the beginning, in Genesis there 1, "Let us make man in our image." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. And I find it interesting that this first mention of mankind in the Bible, right at the beginning there, in chapter 1, is in reference to God's relationship with us, that we're made in his image. And we didn't come from apes because we came from dust. God made us from raw materials, from the dust. He didn't say, no, I made chimps and mankind gradually got there eventually down the track. It's either real history or it's myth. It's a mythological story. The scriptures are not myth. In fact, Eve was taken from the side of Adam. She didn't evolve from an ape called Lucy either. It's real history. It's not theological mumbo-jumbo. And the way I like to word it is that people try and do theological gymnastics, fitting in millions of years with creation and the biblical story. So the picture of creation is one that's going downhill. From the very good creation, sin entered, and sin is the problem. It's the ultimate problem which Jesus came to solve. The Creator himself came into this world to solve it. And the world has changed, but it hasn't evolved. The world has changed from some of these things that we've been talking about tonight. The catastrophe of a flood, the catastrophe of sin and degeneration. So how do you get from Adam to everyone else? Well, you start with Adam and Eve, and you go for it's approximately 1,600 years. You get to Noah and his wife. They had 3 sons before the flood who were married. All of them got onto the ark. Really interesting that the Chinese word for boat, by the way, is made up of 3 characters that mean 8 mouths on a vessel. I've had Buddhist Chinese come into our museum and look at that and say, yes, that's right, and take scriptures with them as a result, take a Bible with them, because they're so intrigued that the biblical history talks about a flood with 8 people on it, etc. Japanese, by the way, as well, who have a similar character. But we're not talking about the Chinese or the Japanese, we're talking about the Aboriginals. Who were they? Australia's first people. Well, from a biblical perspective, they have to be descendants of Noah's sons. The whole world was destroyed. 8 people survived. And the Bible says in Genesis 10, by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So how do we get all this variation? The white skin, the black skin, the slightly different features that we have. Well, let's look at it from Noah's sons. And in biblical naming, it's a little bit different to the way we do it. I gave my kid's name, one of them's middle name's Hunter because we came from the Hunter region. I suppose it's got some meaning, but Ham means burnt or dark. Japheth actually means light, fair. Shem is not a colour. And so we have this indication by the time we get to Noah that there is likely to be some genetic variation happening even in his own children. Right? That's just a little hint that we're given. So this is what's happening. Brown, the most dominant colour still in people across the planet, is starting to break down, and there's a number of genes. It's quite complicated, but there's a number of genes that drive the production of melanin in our melanin-producing cells under our skin called melanocytes. There's some of these mutations are starting to happen, part of this degeneration, and you're getting darker and lighter. So you've got this before the flood, but by the time you get to the Tower of Babel, where basically all people, there would have been some, I'm sure, take off and head in different directions, but Nimrod he was a great hunter and gathered the people together at Babel. You've got this Babel people. So by the time you get to Babel, you've got a further loss of these control genes. It's still degenerating, right? And you've got more extremes of colour. So perhaps this is what's starting to happen. Some of these mutations are, by and large, inheritable. These extremes are starting to increase. So you've got dark people, you've got light people, and they're at the Tower of Babel there. There's other examples of this sort of thing happening. For example, in the eye, I came across this headline in a sort of a science news outlet online called Popular Mechanics. Everyone with blue eyes may descend from a single human ancestor because they've all got exactly the same mutation. Maybe it was Japheth, because most people with blue eyes are descended from the Caucasians. Crossed the Caucasus, went west. Gomer, for example, one of the grandsons of Noah, father of the Scythians and father of the Celts and the Gauls, who then invaded England and those sorts of regions, and some of the others like Magog, the Russian groups, the Balts and others as well. I'll keep moving, I won't ponder on that too much. So the Babel people are spreading all over the earth. Well, what happened there? God divided the languages, and they were divided in perhaps big family groups. Certainly, I think there would have been family groups divide, and so now you've got a segregation where there's not as much mixing. So the darker skinned groups went, the descendants of Ham, and the lighter skinned groups went towards Europe, the descendants of Japheth, and a lot of the Shemites, the Semites, stayed around the Middle Eastern areas, etc. And of course, in the centuries following, there was lots of mixing as these people invaded each other and so on. But early on, you've got this segregation as people went and escaped and took their groups with them. But the evolutionary picture is that skin colour has evolved to deal with UV. And a lot of people think this. In summary, it's saying that because if you're darker skinned, like Africans, for example, you need protection from the sun in the harsh sort of equatorial regions. If you're in the more sort of hemispherical extremes, you need more access to light so you can get vitamin D production. So therefore you've evolved lighter skin. Well, let's just have a test of this. UV light is highest in the tropical regions where the equator right there is. And it's lowest in the darker regions. Here's a map from a scientific publication showing where the native groups of people and their skin colours are spread across the world. So you've obviously got the Africans, Australian Aboriginals, some in India are the darkest ones, Papua New Guinea, are some of the darker groups. Now just try and keep that map in mind a little bit as we look at the dispersal of peoples from Babel, and we'll pull a few other things out. Because let's have a bit of a reality check on skin colour. Just like eyes, there is known gene mutations. There's a scientific paper talking about the MC1R gene, they called it. And in Spain, this mutation affects about 20%, up to 20% of the population. The rest of them, the other 80%, hold a fairly Mediterranean olive brown skin. But it is these people perhaps living in areas with lower UV, like maybe in slightly cooler areas or different elevations. But let's just look at where that lands. Light colour in Spain up there, you got the dark colour of the Australian Aboriginals. They're approximately the same latitude. Okay? So what happened with the Australian Aboriginals? Did they evolve dark skin colour? No. They brought it with them from the dispersal of Babel. They started with those genes. Whether there's mutations in the darkening, they have highly productive melanocytes producing the melanin, and they took it with them, as did the Africans. There's the Oyster Cove mob. You can see they're quite dark. That's mid-1800s, by the way, 4 or 5 decades after Europeans had been here. Where's Oyster Cove? Well, many of you in this part of the world probably know, in the southeastern edge of Tasmania, right down there. They're dark. They have evolved that. It's nothing to do with evolution. It's to do with what their heritage was. Well, let's look at this dispersal of the sons of Ham. Who was the dark one? After Babel dispersal, there's a lot of archaeological evidence around the edges of Saudi Arabia up in the Red Sea there, that there was very early settlements associated with the Mesopotamians, actually. Cush is the ancient name and biblical name for Ethiopia, which is the headwaters of the Nile, which then runs north into Egypt there. And the Cushites were always depicted as dark in even Egyptian art. They were dark. Mizraim, the Mizraimites, it's referred to, Egypt is referred to as Mizraim, who's a grandson of Noah, son of Ham, and they established Egypt. Put, another son of Ham, father of the North Africans, the Berber groups and others. And then, of course, we've got Canaan, another son of Ham. And where was Abraham sent? To the land of Canaan, where there was four kings there when Abraham was there. But there were another 5 sons of Canaan that didn't go that way. We're not told a lot about them, but we have reference to the Sinites. We still use a term in this day and age linking to this group. Our study of China is called Sinology. Australian-Chinese relations is Austro-Sino relations. There's at least one of the tribal groups went that way. And others, the darker Indians, the Dravidic Indians, the Southeast Asians and Australian Aboriginals are in this group. So that's what we're saying. Now, this is a map in a current exhibition in the Queen Victoria Museum on extinctions and so on, but I was most interested in the flow of people, where they say people have entered in. Don't worry about the time frames. I disagree completely with those. That's on an evolutionary perspective. But where's their starting point? Right there in Africa, out of Africa. We've evolved from apes out of Africa, from the evolutionary idea. But it's so interesting how those migration patterns fit what the Bible said for thousands of years. But our starting point is Babel, right there. Very interesting, the links. Okay, let's follow this through. I'm going to keep moving. So if those group of Canaan's descendants went into India, and then some of them moved on down through into Southeast Asia and got to Australia, how did they get there? Well, they followed land bridges that became present in the Ice Age. And there's genetic studies that link them together. Now, I'm just going to skip through these pretty quickly because of our time. But it's basically showing you, these genetic studies, that there's links between the Dravidian Indians, the Austroasiatic tribes, and the Australian Aboriginals. And that's basically saying the same thing. They found certain mutations that are very specific to the Aboriginal groups and the Indians. They're not found in other groups. They've gone down through, like eyes for maybe the European groups, and then down through the skin of the Canaanites. This is a different study where they looked at 344 individuals and showed linkages between the Australian Aboriginals, the Papua New Guinea Highlanders, a Negrita group in the Philippines, and others from around the world. Well, we're going to look at this really quickly in a second as well, but the flow of the Canaanites, the Chinese, the Japanese, the North American Indians across the Bering Strait, these links are all there. But this is the important conclusion that these guys got to that I want to raise. They said that there was important links between Indians and northern Australian populations about 141 generations ago by their calculations. So these are things are estimates. They're trying to estimate rates of mutations going back into the past. They estimate 141 generations ago, and they give you a time, 4,230 years, which lands you right about the time of the Tower of Babel. Their estimates. Not a Christian study, but why don't we ever hear about this connection? Because if Australian Aboriginals got here 65,000 years ago and were basically isolated from the rest of the world, how do you get those links? Politically incorrect thing to raise, I think, sometimes. But even the writers of this paper actually say why this has been missed in the past. They'd said one study back in 2010 missed it by not including Indian populations in their study. So you're not going to find what you're not looking for, right? And they also said another group, a different project, dismissed signs of gene flow from India as a mistaken result, a spurious result. So they said, well, there's a link in our thing, but we're going to exclude that. That's spurious. Okay, and this sort of thing happens in science all the time. Let's look at another link. You know that dog? Dingoes? Well, yes and no. That's what they really are. The American Carolina dingo, the New Guinea singing dog, the Canaan dog. The Canaan dog. Oh, there's our link. The Basenji dog in Africa, the Cushites, descendants of, Cush, brother of Canaan, in the Australian dingo. Well, let's just look at one of those, the Saudi Arabian Canaan dog. Ancient breed, well known over there. Go and do a Google search on it and look it up. Looks very much like a dingo, doesn't it? Curled tail and all. It's in some of the archaeological art that they've got over there. Well, these dingo-like breeds, where are they found around the world? Well, there they are. The Basenji dog, I've got a couple of the pictures of them there. I had a lady from the Philippines in one of these talks, well, actually not this talk, but one that we brought this up in, and she said, oh, we've got dogs like that in the Philippines. So I looked up that as well, and okay, interesting. Well, remember our spread of the Canaanites, or the Hamites actually, the descendants of Ham, the darker skinned ones? That follows the pattern of Ham's dispersals. And they took, at least some of them, took some of these dog breeds with them. So people arrive in Australia. We believe it's not out of Africa, but out of Babel. And you can do this within decades, within 100 years or so maybe. It doesn't have to take tens of thousands of years, as is the typical story. By the way, in my lifetime even, that length of time has increased by another 10,000 years every 10 years or so. So these are the paths to Australia. Let's look at this really quickly. During the post-flood ice age, I'd love to go into this in a little bit more detail, but we can't. The flood explains the ice age better than secular geology can. They throw their hands up in the air. We don't know how it can happen. We won't go into that tonight. Ask me a question if you really want to know. But the post-flood ice age happens because of the steam in the air, making the atmosphere cold, but the oceans are warm, all the volcanic activity and other things. And so you've got evaporation, cold atmosphere, precipitation, snow and ice. The oceans drop. And see those light blue areas there? These are the land bridges. And even the evolutionists give these land areas names, Sundaland and Sahuland. And there's a study done that looked at settlements off the coast, the current coast of Australia, just last year. A bathymetry study, they found Aboriginal artefacts under the ocean. They found evidence of settlement, and they believe it was a lush environment. But we've got to get to Australia. We've got to get through Australia to Tasmania. Well, you can see that under the water where Bass Strait land bridge is. That's about 150 metres deep at its deepest and 50 metres at its shallowest. Well, that's within the range of what the ocean levels. I mean, this is totally accepted in secular fields tens of thousands of years ago. So the Aboriginals at least went that way, if not right across the middle. And I've just added that map as well, which I took today at the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery, showing the red and orange bits of land bridges that they accept. They just put quite a few more thousand years on it. Let's fit this in with the Bible. We got a flood from the biblical time frame, about 2350 BC. You've got Babel about 100 years later, so the population's probably built up maybe to around 10,000, depending on what assumptions you apply. The post-flood ice, well, let's go to the Aboriginals getting here, just even if you did it on foot. It's approximately 22,000 kilometres from Babel. If you went 220 years, travelling 100 kilometres a year, you'd make it by about the time of Abraham. That's only 3 kilometres a day. If you were escaping war or fear or whatever else was going on, and you still had boating capacity, you could do it a lot quicker than that. We're being conservative here, but you can get there by the time of Abraham. Well, and that's another picture, by the way, from the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery of a Tasmanian Aboriginal in the first half of the 1800s. There's the Ice Age estimate by creation modellers of a post-flood Ice Age, where the oceans would have dropped and the land bridges, even across the Bering Strait between Russia and North America, getting the American Indians across there, and others down into the Philippines and Indonesia, etc. But at the end of the Ice Age, and there's lots of Aboriginal legends across Australia about a sudden ocean rise. And secular anthropologists have said this must have happened because there's so many disparate groups of Aboriginals with the same story. There was a sudden ocean rise. But Bass Strait was cut off. And Tasmanian Aboriginals, if they had boat building capacity, really it declined, or they largely lost it. They make canoes like that, but you can't get across Bass Strait in a canoe like that. Well, it'd be one hairy ride. Now, how many Aboriginals were here when white European settlers turned up in the early 1800s? Encyclopaedia Britannica puts it as few as 4,000. And most estimates, if you go out there looking, and I've looked around at a number, put it down as less than 15,000. I worked with a scientist who raised this very query with me. It was the first time I'd ever heard about it, probably 20 years ago now. And that intrigued me at the time. And I've looked into it a lot more since. Let's very quickly look at the post-flood changes in flora. Because Tasmania's got heaps of unique flora and fauna. We've actually got the shortest eucalypt known, Eucalyptus coccifera, which is found up in the mountains. You've got it in this area as well. But we've also got the tallest eucalypt. In fact, the tallest flowering plant in the world. And these aren't growing necessarily all that far from where the shortest ones are growing. Now, I believe the created kind of eucalypts is the created kind, and they've modified. You can call it evolution if you want, because evolution has got so many thousands of different definitions, but I think it's downward modification through natural selection, which is a real process, another topic for another day. But the eucalypt kind has modified and varied. With a drying climate, at the end of the Ice Age, at the end of the precipitation, and Australia dried, our continent changed dramatically. Tasmania did as well with its mountain uplift, its cold climate in the mountains especially, our fertile valleys from all the volcanic activities and other things. And you've got this range of environments that eucalypts just happen to be the best survivors. And they modify. But there's other things like pencil pine, the Athrotaxis genus. King Billy pine is another one of these. And I believe they were probably the same created kind, and similar things happened. Same with the podocarp, Huon pine and celery top pine. They've modified, probably the same created kind. Have they evolved? Well, they're certainly different plants now from, I think, again, adapting to the changing environment post-flood. And this probably happened fairly quickly in the centuries first following the flood. The leaves on that celery top, by the way, aren't leaves. The leaves are basically gone in celery top, and they're modified branches. Quite possibly, a lot of branches do have chlorophyll producing capabilities. What about the fauna? We've got some really unique animals here. Post-flood Australia had megafauna, so did Tasmania. And in fact, the thylacine is regarded as a megafauna. It was a big one, but it's gone now. And it's gone in our European, at least, settlement time frame. The Tasmanian devil, you actually do get bigger ones of these in the fossil record, probably another 20% bigger. Let's just quickly cover this. In the Nullarbor Plain, which isn't an Aboriginal term, null means none and arbor means tree, it's a European name, no trees. By the time Europeans came, that lush environment was gone. And this study, which was reported in Nature, is talking about a treasure trove of these megafauna, animals that need lots of food to eat, found in a treeless, barren place. It was definitely once much more lush. And this is post-flood fossils, by the way. They found thylacines there. Thylacines have been found in Papua New Guinea, thylacine fossils, and in every state in the mainland of Australia except New South Wales, so Queensland, Western Australia, etc. So these creatures have travelled down the same land bridges as the Aboriginals to get to Australia, and some of them made it to Tasmania. Our kangaroos hopped here. Our Tasmanian devils ran here, and many of our other animals made it here in the time that was available to them before the land bridge was flooded again. So that's a Tasmanian Zygomaturus, basically a giant wombat. We've got small wombats now. They've degenerated. Again, same sort of thing. I think it's probably, and we're not dogmatic about this, same created kind, probably as things have degenerated and adapted, they've survived as smaller creatures in this modern day. That's Dr. Diane Eager, our medical biologist. So what killed the cave megafauna in the Nullarbor and other areas? It's very politically incorrect because it's either climate change or it's Aboriginal hunting. Either of them have ramifications, and maybe it was a combination of both. The megafauna couldn't survive on the dwindling diet availability in a drying continent at the end of the Ice Age. The climate was settling down after, the flood was the first major climate change. It was dramatic. And Australia's lost more than 90% of its large species as a result. Maybe the Aboriginal hunting, there's a big wombat, I'm going to eat that and kill that, and the whole tribe can eat that. Let's conclude now. Why does it matter? Because their heritage is the same as the Japhethites, the Europeans. The Celts, the Druids, they weren't Christians. They were pagans as well. And they needed to hear this message of Jesus Christ as much as the Australian Aboriginals did. This is a very important subject because as Tasmanian Aboriginals, if you're European, if you're from some other culture around this earth, your background is the same as the person sitting next to you, ultimately, when you go back far enough. And it's because there is a God who has told us real history in his book through multiple writers. It's incredible when you think about how he possibly has done this over such a vast period of time with all the writers of the scriptures and got to a coherent message. And Paul used this when he spoke to the Greeks in Athens, who were philosophers. He was a Jew speaking to Greeks about why a Roman killed a Jew. Pilate was the one in charge, wasn't he? Said Jesus will die. What did the Greeks care? Paul started to the Greeks. He didn't do this to the Jews in the synagogues, but he did to the Greeks. He started from creation, that God made one man. And from this one man, he allowed people to spread across the earth so that they should seek God in the hope that they might find their way towards God. We're all in this fog ultimately until we discover God and meet him. We're in this fog. Where is God? I need to find him. But where did Paul get to? He didn't end it there. He ended it at the resurrection. That this God came into this earth to show us who he was, tell us who he was, and he proved who he was. And Paul does this a number of times in Acts, actually. He always gets to the point he proved who he was by rising from the dead. The grave was empty. That's the ultimate proof. And so each one of us has to get to that point where we will accept the incredible gift that God has given us through Jesus Christ. I think it's perfectly balanced because it takes faith. It's a free will choice, just as it was a choice that Adam and Eve had not to sin in the first place. God gave them a choice so that they weren't just puppets on a string and they had a relationship with God. I choose to love you, God. I choose to obey you. And God's still doing that to us now by saying, I want you to choose Jesus. I want you to put your faith in me, have a relationship with me, because your history is linked to my creation of mankind in the first place, from dust. Christ is every man's creator, every woman's creator. He's every person's judge. And that's what the flood, sadly, is largely about, the judgment of sin, God's power. But he gives us a great hope to reconnect with him, a good God, a loving God. Will you take that? Please speak to someone if you haven't done that. tonight. Sorry that it's gone a little bit over time, but thanks for your patience. You want more information, see one of our websites, sign up to our newsletter. Do we want 1 or 2 questions? Probably too late. Yeah, I think it's gone past that. Come and see me personally if you want to hang around.